All right, let's go ahead and kick off our Millennial Mindset Sunrise series this morning. I just have to start with a really heartfelt thank you. Thank you for getting up early. Thank you for joining us in a conversation that is very, very exciting because we've got the energy of millennials on our stage this morning. And I just have to give you a little bit of background of why are we here? How did this come about? Katie and I have been working together for a couple of years now as I've been working with the social media and communication aspects of what we do at NIAA. And as we were thinking about this conference and what we can do to, add something that is a little bit different, I pitched this idea. I said, why don't we, instead of talking about millennials, why don't we welcome 4 on our stage this morning and talk with them? One of the things that I learned in about 5 years ago, I joined the world of agriculture and I started working for the American National Cattlewomen. And I really didn't know a whole lot about agriculture outside of the fact that I was born and raised in Pocatello, Idaho, where there's more potatoes and cows than people, and the fact that I really enjoyed to eat. Right? And in that conversation, where I first started working in agriculture, one of the number one things that was talked about was a millennial. And before this time, I had really no idea what a millennial was. I'm not a millennial, unfortunately. I'm an Xer. But I started going to the beef checkoff meetings. I started going to the cattle industry conventions. And in every single conference, the millennial is something that we talked about. As I was going and asking the beef checkoff for funding for programs, the millennial is why we got funded. Because we know that they're the largest generation in our world's history. And we also know that they are controlling a lot of the purse strings, right? And it's only going to grow. And so we know that we've got to talk with them, right? But like I said before, we talk about them. And so as we were creating this experience, we wanted to bring 4 students with 4 diverse experiences to share with you. And that's what you're going to hear over the next about 45 minutes or so. And so we'll introduce each of our amazing speakers, but before we do that, I have to give a special thanks to Sierra Jepson. And Sierra is here from Amanda, Ohio, and she was on my National Beef Ambassador team several years ago. And when I was looking for amazing people, I called Sierra and I said, okay, tell me, who do I need to have? And she really, really came to the occasion, or rose to the occasion, and I hope that you love the panel that we have created. And so you're going to hear from each speaker for about 10 minutes. We're going to have some conversation. And the most important thing is that if you have a question that you would like this panel to address, please let us know. And we would be more than happy to make that happen. We will end right on time so that we can launch into our opening session. And so with that, let's go ahead and begin. So our first speaker today is Carley Snyder. And Carley is an undergraduate student at The Ohio State University, and she's studying agri-science education. And she's going to be pursuing her master's. And she's got some really interesting global perspectives because she's traveled outside of the United States several times. She has gone to Ecuador, she's been to Brazil, she's been to Honduras, she has been to Mexico, and she has a really rich background in education and passion there. So, Carley, why don't you start us off this morning by just telling us, why are you interested in this global conversation, and what do you think that we need to be talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So my interest overall in global food production didn't really start until I came to college here at Ohio State and had the opportunity with the College of Ag to travel abroad and see what exactly food production looks like outside of the U.S. I grew up on a small beef cattle farm and was surrounded by agriculture in southern Ohio, and I had seen a lot of that, but had never really conceptualized what it looked like outside of Ohio, really, but especially outside of the U.S. And across borders. And so having the opportunity to explore out really poked my interest in that and started my interest in pursuing more information, and that's actually part of the reason I'm pursuing my master's, is so I have opportunity to still engage in global agriculture. And as a part of my master's next year, I'll actually be traveling to countries in Europe to engage in that. So overall, when I think about global food production and what really matters, I have to come back to my roots and talk about education. I am currently a student teacher, and so this is actually my 14th week of engaging with high school agricultural education students and teaching them about animal agriculture actually in one of my courses, and then a variety of other things as well. And I love doing it, but it has really shocked me in a lot of ways to see a younger generation, younger than the millennials, knowing so little about what is going into the production of their food. In addition to that, when I did travel abroad last summer, I spent 3 months in Mexico working with millennials and also working with youth, and seeing that same theme of such a strong lack of education amongst those individuals. I also saw a lot of differences in education amongst producers. So while I was in Mexico, for example, I engaged with some beef producers there and spent a lot of time on the ranch helping them out, and just seeing how different the resources they have as far as knowledge and skill goes was really a shock to me. Thinking back about what we do here in Ohio and what my family did on our farm and what other families do on theirs, and seeing that it was something they could do, but they just didn't have the knowledge to do. So when I think about global food production, education is something that absolutely rises to the top for me.
So as you had this experience working with the producers and recognizing that there was a different mode of operation, was there something that really stood out that was different? Like you're like, oh my gosh, why aren't they doing this? Or, why is there such a big gap? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, so for example, I got there in the middle of June, and they had just gotten about 40 head of replacement heifers to the ranch, and I went out to the ranch the first day to see them and noticed right away that most of their heifers had pink eye. And so I asked the ranch manager if they had been treated, and he had no idea that they needed to be treated for this infection. And so I actually had to help him go through the process of course, my Spanish skills weren't as strong as his, so having him call the vet, having the vet come out, and the veterinarian himself actually did not vaccinate them correctly, and so 3 weeks later he had to come back out. So seeing that right there, something so simple, thinking back to when I was in middle school and, my dad and I vaccinated our cattle for pink eye or something like that. That was such a simple thing. There's so many more things that could happen that would be harder to deal with and more serious to deal with. But that simple thing was something that they had no idea about, and that I, coming from thousands of miles away, had to tell them, hey, this is something you might want to check out, was just really shocking to me.
Wow. So the education piece, whether it's a producer or a millennial, would be really important. So talk to me more about the youth aspect. Why do you think it's so important to involve youth in the education? Obviously, education, knowledge is power, but tell me more. Why does that matter so much?
Yeah, so I'll touch real quick on something else you just said. I'm super passionate about education with youth, but I also see how important it is for education and transparency amongst education between producers, especially on that topic of global food production. And that's something I would love to chat about if anyone has questions on that. But regarding youth in agriculture, if we sit down and think, we were talking about millennials, and being a millennial, I don't think about millennials because I am one, so why would I think about that? And so for me, I think about the next generation, and that's younger students in high school that I do have the opportunity to work with a lot. And it's so important for them to know about education. So for example, I have a student who's pursuing a degree in agronomy here at Ohio State next year. And he has a lot of information about that because that's what his family does and that's what his dad does. I have, on the other end, a student who's interested in becoming a veterinarian, and she's in my animal anatomy course. And yesterday we dissected an entire market gilt, and she had no idea about a lot of the pieces and parts of that, and she's a junior in high school, and that's a career she wants to pursue. Granted, she'll have opportunity to learn, but at that level, seeing that she has no conceptualization as to that is what the inside of a pig looks like, or that is what where our meat comes from, and even just having those simple conversations. Last week we were talking about food production just as a tangent in class because someone asked a question, and I realized by a raise of hands that about 90% of my students didn't have a real strong understanding of how our industry actually produces meat. They didn't see that concept of where it went from the cow they drive by out in the field or the pig down the road. They didn't see the conceptualization of how that then gets to their plate. And so if they learn now and have an understanding now, then it won't necessarily have to be as much of a conversation with them when they're at the age of us millennials, and seeing that going forward.
So that makes a lot of sense. as you talk to educators, as you talk to cattlewomen, as you talk to people in this room, they say, yeah, we know, but what's going to get us in the classroom? Because oftentimes that's the barrier. And so how do we get in there talking to, whether it's millennials or the Gen Z that's coming behind them, what's going to make it something that we actually, we can do?
So for me, it feels a little more simple to do because I am in agricultural education classes, and so my students, for the most part, want to be learning about the industry. They want to be learning about a piece and part of that. But that's not all of them. I teach about 40% of the high school population at the school I'm at, and so that's not even half of them are learning and engaging in the industry. This is actually a conversation I've had with my mom a lot because she's an elementary teacher, and we talk a lot about how can we start people learning and children learning about the industry even younger. And she has actually started implementing some things in her class. So for example, she gets a math worksheet, and instead of saying Jimmy bought 25 candy bars and sold 10, how many does he have left? Jimmy bought 25 bushels of soybeans and sold 10, how many does he have left? So they're not only learning that core concept that they need to be learning, they're engaging something that's a lot more practical and applicable to their lives. And so that's a simple way that an elementary teacher is kind of doing that right now as an educator. It's something I see being able to be transgressed across all ages. I have a really strong interest in, as I pursue grad school, this is probably something I'll be researching a lot in cross-curricular work. And so as an agri-science educator, why am I not working closely with the biology teacher? We're teaching similar concepts. Why doesn't she apply what I'm teaching in her class and I apply what she's teaching in mine? Or why don't we work together on a project? Why don't I work with a chemistry teacher and we talk about, soil acidity, or we talk about water conservation with the biology teacher? Why is that not something that's happening? And it is something that's happening, but not nearly as much as it should be.
All right. I have one more question for you before we let you go. So as you think of this global view, what do you think the number one thing that we need to do in terms of education is?
There's so much. When I think about the global view, in my personal experiences with education, I think the biggest thing that can be impacted to really change the industry as a whole is educational transparency amongst producers. Just the shocking that I saw in Mexico and also in other countries. I traveled to Brazil with Sierra, and we saw a lot of the same type of factors. Education transparency amongst those. Why are our producers, granted, obviously resources vary where you're at. Obviously financial resources, natural resources vary. But why do the knowledge and skills we have not transgress across those borders? Why right down the road in Mexico are they doing things that are very simply done here that they don't have an understanding for? So working on figuring out a way, and at Ohio State actually I've engaged with a lot of faculty members who are working on that type of project. That's what brought me to Honduras, is working with a faculty member in education who's working on implementing things like that in Honduras so that the producers and the agriculturalists there can start to kind of carry over the knowledge and skills that we have here in the U.S.
It's all about synergy.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right. Next, we have a panelist who did not come from the world of agriculture. We thought it was important to share not only people who are involved on the day-to-day or studying agriculture, but somebody that, is seeing it from the outside in. And so please join me in welcoming Merritt Ogle. Merritt is a senior at Ohio State. She's majoring in public affairs and international relations with minors in Russian and public health. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about this. And she has spent time interning in St. Petersburg, actually, in Russia, and she spent a month in southern Germany as a participant in a G20 youth forum on international policy. And so you talk about chops, this girl has it. And she's got big sights and wants to be working outside of the U.S. And so why don't you go ahead and just tell us a little bit about why is it something, why did you choose to be on this stage today? When I call you, you're like, sure, I'll be there. Why do you care?
Yeah, I actually wanted to share an anecdote about this morning because we've been laughing about it. So, we all received these things in our bags this morning, and I was like, oh, what a weird ice scraper I got. And Sierra looks at me, she goes, that's an ear tag. And I was like, oh no, and when I was preparing to kind of come here, when Sarah called me to say, am I interested in doing this? I was like, heck yeah, but I was really nervous because I'm like, I don't know what I have to share with you that these people don't. And then when we were talking this morning, and Carley says, well, Merritt, you're the average millennial. And I was like, yeah, I am average, but that's good. And then I think about my own personal experiences, and I've been exposed to more ag in my life than I feel like the average millennial has. When I was in middle school, I worked on an Amish farm over the summers. I actually lived on the Ohio State Fairgrounds all 4 years in high school as the choir ambassador, not junior fair board or anything like that. And ag is something that, it introduced me at Ohio State to people like Carley and Sierra who, taught me about things. And something that Carley said to me this morning was, we really always appreciated you because you gave your own side, but you also listened to our story, and that's something that we didn't feel like a lot of our non-ag friends did. And I think that that's something that, going along with Carley's piece of education for people that coming from agricultural backgrounds is something that's really important to continue into students who, I grew up in Upper Arlington, Ohio, which is a suburb of Columbus, and the closest thing to me that was farm-related was Ohio State's campus, and the ag campus on Ohio State. I didn't come from this background, but I think now moving into my policy experience in that world, millennials don't have a good conception of where their food is produced. They don't have a good conception of education about, how it's produced. Is it sustainable? Is it not sustainable? Those are things that I think are really, really important to share with the millennial population, because I think, from my experience, the majority of my friends are becoming vegetarians and vegans. In preparation to talk here today, I actually looked up a few studies, and a lot of things cited that baby boomers, if there was a reduction in meat eating, it was byproduct of cost. However, for millennials, a lot of millennials are citing, well, it's bad for climate change, I don't want to eat meat, it's better for me, it's better for our world if we don't eat meat. That conversation needs to change, and I think the only way that we're going to get that to change is to make sure that there is a connection between people coming from agricultural backgrounds and not. And I think that especially for the millennial population, for someone who's experienced so much personal education through my peers and through educational opportunities at Ohio State, college campuses are such a great place to start by saying, if we could get it earlier, that would be awesome too. But at least it opens the conversation so young people go out into the world saying, look, I know something about agriculture, I know where my food comes from, and I have actual facts about it.
So not being in agriculture, and then when you come to school, you're being influenced by your peers. What was your frame kind of before, and what really, formed those opinions?
Yeah.
And tell us, then we can move into here's how is it shifted.
And as I mentioned, I've been really lucky because a lot of my friends on campus do come from agricultural backgrounds. And so I was talking this morning, Sierra taught me that there's multiple kinds of cows, things I didn't know. And I think, again, that's an average millennial perspective. People don't know that. A lot of my opinions were shaped by my peers, and it really started as very informal dialogues by saying, look, here's what I learned growing up about meat production, and that it's not good because, people aren't fair to their animals, and people like Sierra would tell me, well, that's not true. And I think in many ways a lot of those informal channels supplemented the fact that I didn't have formal channeled education. And I think that could really be improved because, now I'm in a bunch of policy classes that all focus on topic areas, and this morning we were talking about, I'm in a class that's looking at food systems, and the majority of people in that course are environmental engineers. And many of them come from the perspective that, again, bad for climate change, let's not eat meat. And there's really no one there to step in and say, well, here's some facts about why that isn't necessarily the case, or framing the message a different way. And I think through those formal channels we can improve that education for non-agricultural students.
So what was it that helped you to want to listen? Because we've heard a lot that the millennials, they don't want to hear facts, and I say the millennials, right? Mm-hmm. But that they don't want to hear the facts, that it's about the emotion. And so how do you balance those things? And I guess, what was the thing that just made you feel like, okay, I want to listen to what Sierra has to say?
Something that we've also kind of talked about as a panel backstage was that social media has played a really big role in the millennials' perceptions and opinions about agriculture and food production. I think many of my friends in high school shared very much let's label GMOs, stop eating meat, we all have to go vegan. And in my head, I came from I was a child that questioned everything. So maybe that was a personal background for me. But I started to think, why is this the only thing that I'm seeing on my news feed? Why is no one saying, like, food production is really important because that's how you eat. No one was having that conversation. It was all, we need to stop doing this and stop doing this so that we can be stopping climate change and moving forward into a sustainable future. And I think that's, for me, what made me kind of question the other side of, well, why are people saying this? But also, are there I shouldn't say alternative facts, another perspective to the story? It's a really important conversation to have, and I think many people, especially millennials, aren't questioning it because also, we grew up in a time where the only way that you knew how to get food, I go to Whole Foods every week. It's the only way I know how to eat. If Whole Foods closed, I'd be done. I don't know what I would do. And I think millennials, for a large part of that, don't know anything else. And so it's really important for them to start questioning. But I also think it's, if it wasn't for people like Sierra and Carley, no one would have questioned me and saying, why did you share that thing on Facebook that said meat's bad? And that conversation had an opportunity to start.
Awesome. So if agriculture could do one thing to improve this relationship with the millennial, what does that look like?
Going back to the social media comment, I think that communication on forums like social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, which we're doing a lot of today, is really beneficial. For many millennials, that's how you get your news. You don't wake up in the morning and go on ABC. You're looking at your social media and your feed and the people that in the network. So it's getting people like Sierra and Carley in the networks of people like me. I think that that's the biggest thing that we can do to promote young people talking to young people, because that really makes a huge difference. Additionally, I interned in D.C. this summer at the International Trade Administration, and weirdly, the two foods that were in my portfolio were poultry and beef. And there was a big conversation there about, well, it's cheaper to produce abroad, let's keep doing that. And it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. I think, policy as a whole is something that we need to focus on, because when we shape policy from above, it affects everyone. So through communication with millennials, through making policy, I think those are two things that the agricultural community can do to really change millennials' perception about meat production.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Merritt. I love it. All right, our next speaker is Sierra Jepsen. As I mentioned before, she was a member of the National Beef Ambassador team, and she is a past state FFA officer and just overall rock star in the world of ag. She's definitely traveled abroad, spending time in New Zealand and all sorts of fun places. I'll let her fill you in on that. But Sierra, why don't you first tell us, what are you studying, and why did you want to come and continue to advocate? Because this is what you've been doing for several years. Why this stage?
Sure. So I'm majoring in agribusiness and applied economics with dual minors in animal science and meat science. And coincidentally, I was supposed to be on a pork and lamb kill this morning, so I decided I probably couldn't make that and get back in dress clothes.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
So my passions drive from my background raised in a production agricultural setting. My dad raises 1,000 acres of corn, wheat, and soybeans in southern Ohio, and then we also have 75 head of beef cattle. And when I was a senior in high school, I was the beef queen of my county, and people like to poke fun at me for that. But as I ran around high school, kind of denying my connection to agriculture, I realized that when I went home, that was when I felt like the truest form of myself, when I was talking to my friends about the cattle that we raised and the way that we raised them and why, that I felt that that was how I was serving my true focus, my true purpose, rather than talking about soccer or talking about my classes. That's where I felt that I was doing my family justice and explaining to my friends that even though we grew up in an agricultural community, some people didn't understand what we did just outside of town. And then as I came to college and met all of my great friends up here, as I joined the National Beef Ambassador team and the State Ambassador teams, I started realizing that not just the people within my millennial community, but people who were a little bit older than me and people younger than me also didn't always have a realization for that connection that we had. And so As I started exploring the beef community, I found a passion within meat science. And my 4th year in college, I took an introduction to meat science class. And 2 days after being enrolled in that class, I decided that this was the perfect way to combine how I had been raised on a beef cattle farm with the conversations that I wanted to have with consumers. Because as a consumer advocate, I felt that I was always repeating the exact same message on just a repeating record. And I never got to share the facts and the information in a scientific way that the producers were using it, and the way that our veterinarians were using it, and knowing the upcoming trends. And I could never figure out how to connect those two relationships until I discovered meat science. And it was a perfect way to take, how can we make more transparent what our producers are doing to get those beef cattle, those pork carcasses, those poultry products to the rail, and how the consumers are then seeing them in a meat case at the grocery store, and being that common ground for them became really important for me. And I'm really excited to hopefully, I'll be pursuing grad school once I graduate here. And those are conversations that I hope to continue in my future.
So as you've traveled abroad, what's been the biggest eye-opening experience in terms of global food production?
Absolutely. So my first study abroad experience was actually when I was a sophomore in college. I went through the animal science department at Ohio State to New Zealand, and we were going to study food and animal agriculture all through the country. We were going to road trip from the very top to the bottom. And as we did that, we visited a variety of places that took us on a lot of back roads. And about halfway through our trip, we were visiting a venison farm just way off in the mountains, and our bus actually broke down, stranding 42 foreigners in a country that sophomores, juniors, seniors from Ohio State had never been before. And fortunately, just a couple miles up the road, we had passed a farm that was processing beef and lamb that day. They were the lamb producers. They were going through and shearing all their lambs, and the cattle producers, their neighbors up the road, were vaccinating. And so rather than sit on this broken down bus in scorching heat for several hours before we could get another bus that was coming from 200 miles away to get to us, we decided to walk up the road. And our instructors asked these producers, would it be okay if 42 American students watch what you're doing today? Now I think about when my family's processing beef cattle at home, it's always really stressful. You think that you don't need a lot of hands, you don't want a lot of commotion, you want everything to be as calm as possible, because you don't know how those cattle are going to act that day. They could do anything. And so you want as few people witnessing and watching, just so that you can keep things calm and controlled. But what these people did was amazing, was they said, absolutely, come on in, you all just walk wherever you'd like. Here's the sheep that are in holding. You can stand over here and watch when we release them, and they're going to run out and frolic with their new freshly sheared coats. If you want to walk up to the neighbors and watch, they're vaccinating up there, feel free. Go out into our pastures, check out our cows, do whatever you'd like. Feel free to ask us questions. We're going to keep working, but you're more than welcome to take pictures, whatever you want, but we're going to keep working. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. Just stand over here, observe, ask us questions. And when I left that day, I've grown up in agriculture, but I thought, what if 42 people were visiting Ohio and they happened to stop at our family farm? What would we say? Would we invite them on, or would we say, no, we're sorry, we're busy. We can't help you today. This is really important. It's very important that we keep this quiet, and we don't like people seeing this. Would that make them feel that we were doing something wrong? Would that make them feel that there was something that they shouldn't see? And so as I started thinking about that experience, it made me think of how we treat millennials, how we treat folks outside of agriculture within our own communities, about what perceptions are we saying, not because we don't want them to see, but because we're afraid that they won't understand. So it became not a question of, how can we bring these people in so that they'll understand more? It's more of, how can we directly invite them so that we can directly educate them and not make them feel that there's something that we're hiding because of the way that we're trying to protect our own farms.
So the transparency that you experienced there was obviously very powerful.
Yeah.
So thinking about the United States, what lesson is there to learn?
Sure. So Carley spoke about educating not the millennial generation, but Gen X. I have a perception as a millennial that those are the people that I want to impact. On Ohio State campus, I started an organization called the Ohio Collegiate Cattle Association. And each year, for the past 3 years, since that trip, I created a Buckeyes for Beef event with a couple other students on campus. And so what this event is every fall, our organization goes out onto a large communal space on Ohio State campus, and we talk to millennial students and we answer their questions through activities and through games and getting them involved with things that seem normal and seem fun. And then as they take part in our games, they take part in a beef cook-off, they start to ask questions that they can't find on Google, basically. Things that if they would have Googled this, they would have gotten an answer from PETA or HSUS or from some other offsite that it's not easy to find an answer to, such as, what does your dad really do on your family farm? What does a hormone really do? Are antibiotics really in my meat? People don't understand, and it's not an easy question to find an answer to on Google. Because we know that that's the first thing that millennials do, is if they have a question, they're either going to look through their news feed, as Merritt said, and they're going to find a lot of other like-minded ideas from people just like them. And if they're not connected to people within agriculture, they're never going to get a different side of that story. And so if they're not satisfied with that answer, they're going to go to Google. And how often do we all go past the first page? Very rarely. So if it's not right there with other ideas that we've already asked Google, then we're not going to find it. So through this Collegiate Cattle Association, through this Buckeyes for Beef event, we're not trying to convince people to eat more meat. We're convincing people to ask questions. And we want them to feel comfortable having a peer-to-peer connection. Because we know that millennials often don't want to talk to people like Sarah. They don't want to talk to people older than them. They want to talk to people who are similar to them, but they might not know that they're very different. They look like me. They're my age. We go to the same university. However, you had a different background, and I'm curious about that, and I want to know more about that, and I trust you because you're here. I don't trust your dad, but I trust you. And so then when they want to ask questions about my family farm, and, well, I don't understand why your dad might raise cattle that way. Well, let me tell you why. Because he's my father, and he raised me, and we're on this same path together. Do you think that he would have fed me a beef product that he didn't think was safe for his kid? He's like, well, no, I would have never thought that. Would you feed something to your child that you don't think is safe? Well, no, never. It's conversations like that that make people realize that agriculturalists that they can't see scare them, but the ones who are here right in their face don't. So it's kind of having that connection and starting conversations that make them feel positive about who we are and what we do.
That's really beautiful. Thank you, Sierra. So I have one final question for you. Who do you think the most influential person in agriculture is today?
Oh, gosh. I guess it wouldn't even be a person, and I think it comes down to a relationship, and it's not even going to be the relationship we're all thinking of between the producer and the consumer. I think it's coming down the relationship between us as young agriculturalists and our parents as we talk about succession planning, and we think that a lot of us millennials who are growing up in agriculture, we might not be going back to the family farm. My dad, he's got 1,000 acres at home, and I want to go and work in a meat industry, in the meat packing plant. Carley, she's got acreage at home, and she's going to go work in a classroom. There's not going to be very many more millennials of us who are actually going to physically be working on the farm. And we talk about, dairy farmers, they put in so many hours. I don't know if I could, really anchor myself to that farm every single day for the rest of my life the way that those dairy farmers do. They are impressive people. And a lot of their sons and their daughters, they look at that same industry and say, could I ever do what my mom and my dad did, or would I like something different? Maybe within agriculture, but physically going back and working on the farms is going to be really tough for millennials. And we want to do it. We do, and we question our ability to do that. And I know my dad, I'm still fortunate to have both of my grandparents. And as my dad and I try to talk about succession planning with my sister, we kind of brush it off because it's like, well, right now, our farm's important, but my dad and his parents' relationship is more important because he's still going to be farming for another 20 years. And how do we help him continue farming, and then my sister and I potentially continue farming as well, or are we going to go do something else? So succession planning is going to be extremely important, and those conversations are really going to shape how the next 20, 50, 100 years go for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Sierra.
Thank you.
Our final speaker is Miss Anya Dandy. I met Anya a couple of years ago, I think it's been 2 years, when we did a campus event in Cornell. So she goes to an Ivy League school, and Oh my gosh, talk about an experience. I had never been to Cornell, and that is a unique campus. And the students there really wanted to have some important conversations. And so Anya was really instrumental in creating that. And so happy to see you again here today. She is studying a lot of different things, but it's agriculture sciences and international agriculture and rural development that really gets her excited. She just returned from a year working in Australia and New Zealand, where she was studying some beach volleyball, I hear. Maybe just a little bit.
It was very important.
She was mustering some cattle and sheep and deer in the outback. And outside of that, she's done important work. She worked on the last Farm Bill. You've worked at the Noble Foundation. And so I'm excited to give you the floor to share your thoughts on global food production. So Anya, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. You know, it's been 16 years since farm policy was mentioned in a presidential debate. And we've seen overall economic growth over the last 3 years. But farm income has declined over all of those years. It dropped 12% last year. Why? You, the hardworking rural folks, are putting food on the national and international table, harvesting more now than what used to take millions to harvest. And yet, we in agriculture have been excluded from the crowded urban-centric policy debate. It's almost as if food production has no place at the policy table. Why is that? You know, as a millennial trying to answer these questions and looking towards the future of agriculture, I come to other questions, such as what are the full possibilities, not just in agriculture for myself, but with agriculture, for agriculture as a whole? And what is the frame for 21st century agriculture that gives us in ag the maximum range of possibilities? So why am I up here talking about frames? Why am I going abstract here? Frames influence and even control not just how others perceive us, but the possibilities that we see for ourselves, for the narratives that we can create about who we are and what we're doing. The pushback, if there's one takeaway that I want you all to have from me today, it's that the pushback that we're seeing against animal agriculture industry today is a good thing. It's an opportunity because it represents interest and passion that we need to revitalize our rural communities. But we need to give people a frame to harness that energy. So today, I'm inviting y'all to join me in creating a frame that speaks to all of you, that speaks to our generation, and that speaks to our fellow voters and consumers.
So I like this idea of the frame. Tell us a little bit more about, like, what does that really mean?
Yeah, a frame's a cool idea. It's kind of a buzzword right now in politics. It's a mental shortcut. It's sort of a rule of thumb. It's a quick, easy way that we process information, the instinctive outlook or perspective that we have towards things. When we talk to people with the same frames, often because we have the same backgrounds, it's really easy to connect. I found I could be in the Australian outback and connect easier with folks than I do when I talk to people from Portland, Oregon, which is the state that I'm from, because we share the same background when we're in rural areas. Frames are really influential when people get new information, complex information, or information that we have very little background in. And information about agriculture is all of those things for most people. And that's especially true for our millennial generation. We're the furthest removed from the farm. And I think that frames are a huge part of this rural-urban divide that we talk a lot about. So, you know, we hear a lot of discussion in ag about education and transparency, and this is phenomenal. You know, we're doing it with Dairy Carey blogs and the Singing Peterson Farm Brothers. We'll hear from Jay Hill tomorrow. And these folks, y'all, you're absolutely right. We need all of this. And those ideas are really targeting us millennials. But when people lack a coherent frame, it's easy for those efforts to be twisted or misunderstood because people can't file the information away in a way that makes sense to them. You know, imagine trying to throw a basketball through a peewee-sized hoop, right? That ball, the statistics, the photos, the videos, and even farm visits can bounce right back out if we don't have a wide enough hoop. So our goal in agriculture today is widening that hoop. And as a millennial entering ag, what I see is an incredible opportunity to create a frame that people can use so that when we educate, when we create transparency, that basketball goes right through the hoop. And it scores us points, essentially.
So can you talk about some of the frames that you see for us in agriculture?
Absolutely. I think historic examples actually are great here. And when we look way back towards our founding fathers, what we see is these farmer statesmen, Jefferson, Washington, Madison. The frame here was that agriculturalists were trusted to not just feed, but to lead our nation. Thomas Jefferson said, "Governments will remain virtuous for many centuries as long as they are chiefly agricultural." He was framing right there. And within this framing, farmers were drivers of state and national policy. But then when we skip through the decades, we see a rise of the frame as agriculturalists as the tamers of the Western frontier. And they were romanticized in films and novels. We saw the classic Western men. The frame was built by the narrative of Gary Cooper and John Wayne, this tough and independent, strong and silent sort of cowboy. And I think this really captured the imagination of rural and urban folks alike. We saw that the Marlboro Man, he showed us that this frame could make money. Ronald Reagan showed that it could gather votes. Reagan used to compare himself to Gary Cooper at high noon. Because even those highfalutin New Yorkers could identify with ranchers who were struggling on the prairies through this frame. They could understand it. And when we look at modern frames in agriculture, I really see two categories. For this first category, I'm going to use PETA as an example because it's so extreme. And this first category is frames that other interest groups put on us in agriculture. And within that frame, they really have three narratives, and you heard them here today. Meat is unhealthy for you and I, for humans. It causes cancer, right? Meat is unsustainable. It's bad for the environment. And meat is torturing animals. Now, I hear that, and that frame makes me angry. And it's wrong. And we know it's wrong, but most people don't. So the second frame, really the important frame, is the frame that we in agriculture have for ourselves. So the problem is today that we're fighting PETA's emotional story with facts, but we don't remember facts. We remember stories. Which brings me to the second category, how we frame ourselves. I think with the Green Revolution, we entered a new frame in agriculture. We stepped into a much larger frame than just taming the Western frontier. We're feeding the world. And for a long time, this most recent cohesive ag narrative of feeding the world was successful, and it was rightfully celebrated. Norman Borlaug won the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize. But today, for my generation, I'd say the outside, often negative narratives, such as modern farming is hurting animals, are winning. Whether it's conscious or not, I think people have bought into PETA's narratives. And there's two problems actually that I see for this. When we look at the feeding the world frame, it's just not big enough. It's not big enough, it's not a wide enough hoop, it doesn't contradict things like modern farming is hurting animals. The narrative that we are feeding the world and we are harming animals, those two things can coexist at the same time. And that's especially true in this world of viral videos. But there's a second reason. We already produce enough food to feed everyone. Yes, far too many people still go hungry, but it's because of food waste and distribution issues. It's not food production. And when we look at the most up-to-date data, we actually only need a 20 to 30% increase in food production to feed 2050 populations. Hunger is no longer a food production issue, but the Feeding the World frame treats it like it is. And that's part of why, speaking for myself, and I think my fellow millennials, when we talk about increasing caloric production to feed the world, it's only really one of many areas that agriculture should be emphasizing. I see the possibility of ag as so much bigger than feeding the world. We can embrace a larger call to action, and in doing so, we can reclaim our own frame.
So what does that larger call to action look like? What is that frame?
Absolutely. Narratives are how we share frames, but I also think that it's where frames come from. So as I think of my own narrative, I was raised on a ranch in Oregon, and I was raised with the belief that richness is having hay in the barn and meat in the freezer. It wasn't a number in the bank account, and I think I'm speaking to a crowd that really understands that feeling. On our ranch, we enrich the soil, we enrich the water, the animals' lives. And as we enrich these, we enrich our family for generations to come, succession planning. And as we enrich our ranches, we create nutritious food, jobs, livelihoods, a quality of life in our community. And then many vibrant communities, together we enrich the world. So for me, I've thought about framing a lot, and what I came up with was enriching the world. This is one possible frame. It spoke to me, and it seemed to encompass a lot of the narratives that I've heard in New Zealand, Australia, the US. And I think it encompasses AG's historic and current role as stewards of the land, which is a powerful frame in and of its own right. But I would love, my invitation to y'all is to join me in analyzing your own narratives and your own experiences and helping develop a frame together.
Awesome. So, for the sake of time, Anya, the last question that I have for you is that, okay, you have traveled the globe. You're studying, doing amazing work there. What's the silver bullet? Like that one thing, if we could do, you talked a lot about frames,
yeah.
But what's the so what, now what?
For millennials, the dominant narrative that I hear, the dominant narrative, is what are we going to be doing about climate changes? Forget whether it's man-made or not. The fact is a majority of Americans today and 2/3 of millennials support climate action. And they want to take personal climate action, and that means deciding where to spend their very scarce dollar. And 58% of millennials, according to Pew, are willing to spend more on products that are environmentally friendly. And I think this presents a tremendous opportunity for us in agriculture, because solid research shows that if we're reducing erosion, if we're building topsoil, we're sequestering carbon dioxide, we're sequestering methane. We can manage our manure, we can manage our fertilizers, and we can reduce nitrous oxide emissions. We can be using solar and wind, methane off our dairies and our feedlots to power our energy needs. And there are so many more things that I think y'all understand far better than I do that we can be doing. And people are already doing these things. They are taking the lead with these sorts of actions. And I think in this case, it's an area where we can celebrate our diversity in agriculture, be we small or large producer, processor, packer. We can all be taking climate action in the things that we do every day. And I think that that is the narrative that we really build a frame to, a frame that speaks to millennials, a frame that encompasses so much of what we do every day. So if there's one takeaway, one silver bullet, I think that we need a frame that gets rid of narratives like modern farming is hurting animals, that a frame that is big enough that it ends that narrative. And I think the way to do that is to tackle climate change. I think that we in agriculture can be leaders there. And I think from that we can develop a frame that changes people's instinctive gut reaction to agriculture so that it's one of respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya.
Grace and elegance.
Well, I think we've enriched the world a bit this morning, and I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us, for missing processing of animals, and really just bringing your heart to the stage. And that heart-to-heart connection is something that we can all work on as we engage in the rest of our day. So thank you so much. If you do have questions for these millennials, we have social media, and that's how we like to communicate, right? And so please send us. We obviously have our Twitter handle, NIAA_COM, C-O-M-M. So you can send us to Twitter. You also have some question cards on your tables. And if you have something specific to millennials, just write that down. Make sure that I get it. We have a couple of social media interns that are here today. Allie is in the front, and then we have Miss Leslie over there, and then we can definitely follow up. And then a couple of the gals will be here throughout the day, and so you can definitely stop them and just have a great conversation. So thanks again, everybody, for being here this morning to talk with our beautiful millennial minds, and we'll see you in just a little bit for our kickoff. Thank you.